Hello, I'm Atlas John, and today we're going to talk about Lightning Out, one of its use cases, and how to deploy it easily with Blue Canvas. So Lightning Out has been out for a while, and I think it's been 5 years or so, and I haven't seen a recent demo or tutorial with Lightning Web Components, which is relatively new at this point, and I want to make a little demo. So what do we mean by Lightning Out? It follows a straightforward development, much similar to developing your own Lightning web component, but it lets you enable to host these web components outside of Salesforce. And there are two ways of doing this. One of them requires an authentication flow, which you would need to have a connected app set up. But today we're going to talk about a use case where it would be a publicly accessible web component page, and it is going to work out exactly like you would expect in Salesforce. And I'm going to show you the steps to how to configure it. For example, let's say that you have this opt-out component, and it is going to be just a regular component with its CSS and JavaScript and a backend to just update or create a new record based on a criterion that we choose. Let's say if the record exists, let's say the email exists as a lead in Salesforce org. So how would you able to test this is what I would do is create a custom tab first. So let's look at it. So I created this Lightning component tab to be able to show you like a preview of the component, but our component is going to be hosted outside of Salesforce, and I'm going to choose to host it on a GitHub page, which is really easy to set up, and I'm going to show you the steps of it also. So you would normally create a new Lightning tab to see how it works out. You would create it, and you can reach it like this. For example, this is how it's going to look like, and it's a simple opt-out request form. If the lead doesn't exist, it's going to create it. So let's just fill com and we're going to see it show a confirmation message. And it creates a new lead like this, so we know that it works. Let's see in the logs. Yep. Now, difference is to be able to see the logs accessed by a guest user, you would also need to set up debug logs, which I'm also going to show you. And I'm hoping to show a beginner's perspective on this. So there are probably a lot of areas to improve this. So feel free to reach me out. Feel free to reach out on our YouTube channel. And we're going to also give the code away on our GitHub repo. So in the first step, when we created the Lightning Web Component to test in our own Salesforce org, there's an additional setting that you would need to define in the meta XML file. This is the metadata of the component to make it exposed by using this flag, and also define it as a Lightning tab. So after you do this, it's going to show up in your org when you try to create a new tab. So after you do that, you can test the component yourself. So what I would recommend is build the component first, test it on a tab, so that you can debug the configuration steps if you come across any problems along the way, because you know the component works, right? So the first step is, for our case, is to enable communities, and now they're called digital experiences, I think. Digital experiences, yes. So we're going to enable these, but we're not going to have like publicly reachable, like a separate Visualforce page that you would normally do if you want to have the same functionality, for example. What I would do is have a publicly accessible Visualforce page, but we're not going to create a page. We're just going to create a community for this case. And let's have a domain. I hope this doesn't exist. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, it's one of these settings that after you turn it on, you can turn it off, like person accounts. So after the confirmation screen, it takes us to this digital experiences page. And I think it's important to get the terminology right here. We're going to have a default community site, but we're not going to have a page for this component to be hosted in, because the component is going to be hosted somewhere completely different. And the Visualforce way of doing this is where you would actually have a publicly accessible Visualforce page. This is different, so let's create a default community like landing page. So I was advised when I was doing this to go with the default one. I think like this. This is not going to be seen by any of the users, but because it's a requirement, we just have to go with it. And so this is the page that you should be seeing after you create your community site. If something went wrong, you can just create another one. We just need a URL of this page, which is this. And we're going to use it in what's called a Lightning dependency app or a dependency app. And what that means is, let's look at the requirements. And the requirement says, first of all, you need a remote web container. What that means is somewhere to host this on an HTML file, and we're going to put the credentials and configuration settings into that HTML file, and only that HTML file is going to be hosted on the other side. Your components, your Apex controller, like Lightning Web Component, obviously, is going to be hosted on Salesforce. And as long as we can host it on a different site, the HTML part, you will be able to see the components if you made the configurations in the correct way. This requirement does not apply to us because we're not authenticated, because we're having a publicly accessible site page where anyone with internet access can see and submit details to Salesforce. Of course, like this has some security considerations, so be careful, obviously, for doing this. And I'm going to show you also to give the appropriate Apex class access, for example, for your guest user, so that they don't have access to everything. There should be also additional considerations for this. And there's also another setting that we need to enable cross-origin resource sharing. Of course, this allows two web pages to communicate between themselves with JavaScript code, so that the page that we're hosting, HTML file, can reach the Salesforce side to be able to create our component in runtime. And this is the Aura dependency Lightning dependency app, and this is required for web components to be hosted on an original server. This app is only used by Lightning Out. And for like Safari users, they need to enable these like cross-site tracking settings. I think I had some issues with some clients before, but it is working with when I tested my own with Firefox and Chrome, it was working okay. If the website does not show up for some reason, but it does show up in your Lightning tab that I just showed you, try opening the site with an incognito mode, for example, on different browsers, and disable if you have any sort of ad blocker or any Chrome plugins. That's why you would need to test in on a incognito mode if you're running any issues. Yeah. So after you created your community site, one of the settings to check is if you have my domain enabled. I'm using a developer org, so got my domain name set to this. So be careful to have the my domain name right, because we're going to give it in one of the configuration for the Aura dependency app. So let's start doing that. And you would normally create a Aura application using this. And after it gets created, the only settings that you need to do is give it an access with global, and also needs to know that it's extending Lightning Out. So give it a Lightning Out app. And the other setting is, the reason why we're using our application is that we're also going to put a dependency as a resource, and we're going to give this to the name of the Lightning Web component. So again, the first step is what I would recommend is to create a web component in your own Salesforce org, make sure that it works. And let's assume that I created before, and that's the name. And I'm going to put it as the web component's name. So And for your dependency app, this is the setting that you would need to do only. And make sure that it gets deployed. So after we create our dependency app, the next step is the HTML file that I was talking about to be created in your repo. And this doesn't have to be in any specific folder. It's just an HTML file that you will host somewhere else. So it doesn't matter where it is. And let's give it a name. So need to have a body or head. And what does it need is a script tag. So the script tag is what's needed to be able to communicate with Salesforce org, and this is where you would need your community's site link, which is accessible here. Go to setup, digital, all sites, and this is the URL that we need. We're going to give the source as this, but also as /lightning/ lightning.out.js. Did I get it correctly? Let's see. Yes, okay. So this is the first script tag. The second one is where we would need to, there are two functions that we need to use. One of them is lightning create and lightning use. And these are like the old like Aura functions that you would need to dynamically create components, if you remember. So this is this is why we need like an Aura app for this case, because we're going to create a lightning web component from an Aura app using JavaScript. So after we set our first script tag to the community site that we just created, and again, you can reach out from here after you created your communities and your site, default site. You also need to add this lightning and lightning out.js extension. And let's look at the arguments that these functions take. So there are two. Let's go one by one. Lightning use. This is like, again, like the $sign functions that we used to have with create component. So we also have create component like down below here, but let's start with this one. The app name is the name of the our dependency app that we just created, which is this one for our case, opt-out form wrapper. And the callback function, we're not going to use for this case, but if you want to do like apply some styling and set to change a couple of things after the component is created, you can use this function. There's also another callback function on create component, which I prefer to use so that I can get like a debug statement, like a console statement, to see that the component creation works. And this is the lightning endpoint URI. It's exactly this part. And authentication token, we're not using this. And let's look at the create component one. Create component one has a couple of arguments. The first one is the component name. It's the LWC component that we're going to create. For our case, it's opt-out form HTML. And you can also pass attributes to this web component. For example, I haven't done this, but if you want to show a record page, maybe you can use force record ID to pass the attribute to LWC, or pass any attributes so you can change them or handle events. So that could be useful. And DOM locator is it is the thing that we're going to target to be able to inject the Aura component. So I'm going to use data tag for this, but you can also use I think a class to be able to do the same function. And the callback is just to be able to log that the component gets created. So I have the code ready, so let me just copy and paste that. So this is the part where most people would struggle, so I'm going to go into detail to every attribute and variable that we're putting here. So like we said, we're going to call in lightning uses callback the lightning create component function. So let's look at our variables, constants. The app name is again the Aura dependency app. Component name is the LWC app. Lightning endpoint is our URL for the community. And a target element is, I'm just setting a div here to be able to target it with the query locator for this DOM element attribute. So we're going to use it down below. And component attributes, even though you're not passing any attributes, you need to create an empty component attributes constant and use it. So the first function takes lightning use, sets out fires, and calls the create component, which is, as you see, after it gets created, it's going to put a console log. And we have the lightning endpoint here. And to be able to style your LWC component, you would also can use style tag. So you can't style your LWC from the LWC's CSS or inline class, for example. So you would need to use something like this. And for example, in Lightning Web Component app, we had an anchor tag, so I'm going to style it, and I'm going to put like a background or color as orange. So this is what you would need to do if you want to style the component. You would need to define it on the HTML. And this is what you need to do for the HTML part. You would also need to host this on an external website and grant access using CORS, guest user access. We're going to go into details there. And let's do a mini walk around with the LWC app. It's I'm using a template if to show a notification after a button was clicked to submit the form, and it shows a message was being sent. And yeah, this is the little anchor tag that I put, and it captures the like information from the form. And I also use like a wrapper function, and this is what I saw how it's been implemented by LWC recipes. So I'm just going to create an object here and pass it to the Apex class. And the Apex class is pretty simple. It's using this wrapper, right? And I'm just creating an empty object. I'm just creating an object to pass the parameters that I'm capturing here, and I'm using imperative Apex to call and call the Apex class with this object as a parameter, and it checks the email if it exists. It updates certain fields like consent description and the pick list field. In our case, it's a text here. If the email doesn't exist, it's going to create a new lead. And yeah, that's it in a nutshell for the component from the Salesforce side, and also this HTML. So right now, if you can host this on a page and make the configuration settings, it's going to create a Lightning Web component that you can reach for outside of Salesforce. So that's pretty neat. So let's show you an example of that. So the next step is to host the HTML file and connect to Salesforce, so we can display it outside of Salesforce. And the easiest way that I found is to use a GitHub page. And to be able to use GitHub pages, you would obviously need a GitHub account. So create one if you don't have one. And it's pretty straightforward. Let's give it a name. Blue Cows App Demo. And it has to be public. And I believe it needs to have a README or an index.html file. So let's create one. Okay. And let's create a new file. Could be empty, doesn't matter. All right. So next part is we're going to create an HTML file. And we're going to use the file that we just created. Yep, the file is created, and now we just have to set up the course settings. So after we create the repo, there are two things we need to do. One of them is course. One of them also is to host the repo as a page on GitHub. It doesn't automatically do it, obviously, after you create a repo. So we need to go to that setting. After you finish the setting, you should see it as a GitHub hosting the page and building it. So in order to enable this setting, you need to go to Settings and Pages and select the folder that your website is going to be built from. And I picked the main branch because that's where our HTML file is located. There's no folder structure there. So as you see, make sure it has an index file. Doesn't matter if it has a README or not, but make sure it has an index file. After you enable, your website is going to be published at your GitHub username, github.io, and the name of the repo. But the site is hosted on the HTML file. So if we go here, let's reload again. This is the repo name, this is the HTML file name, and we have the working form. But of course, you also need to enable course for this, and the course setting is pretty easy. You just, from the pages, you just use this URL, the root, and put it on the allowed origins list. And that's it. And also, one thing that I missed when I was showing you the demo was to use this allow guest access tag. Without it, it's not going to work because that's the only configuration you need to be able to make guest users reach your site. And also, just to go over settings again, is to go to all sites. This is the URL that you need to use. You can also create an empty site, but you need to use the community's digital experiences URL, and it's this one. And you use it as an endpoint, and you can actually test it after you create it like this. Okay, we do have a community page, so it should be redirecting and pointing out to the right endpoint. So make sure to allow this property on your Aura dependency app. And let me also show you how to allow guest user access again. Even every community or digital experience needs to have a website, and this is our URL. Again, it's the login page again. You go to public access settings, and you enable the Apex class access to the ones that we just created, which is like the up.form controller. You can also enable these, but make sure you got the security settings right. So after we make sure allowed user access from the Aura dependency app, and don't forget it like I did, let me show you how to see the debug logs generated by the guest user if you don't know it already. And it is pretty straightforward. You just go to debug logs, and this is a trace flag set up by my own user when I connect the IDE. So the only logs that would be generated from this would be the operations that was made by my own user. Because we're letting access from the guest users, we also have to set a debug log for that. And let me find it. Okay, now we can submit information to the form and show it up on the debug logs. I'm just going to look at the wrapper object here and see if we're getting some values. Okay. As you see, we're getting the fields that we requested, and the form is working successfully. So if this email hasn't been on the Salesforce store as a lead, it would have been generated as one. I'm not sure. Let's see if it got created. Yep. So this email was on Salesforce org already, so must have been modified. And the time checks out. Okay, so the form works. you've seen how to implement Lightning Out and host Lightning Web Components outside of Salesforce. How are we going to deploy it? Let's see how we can deploy this with Blue Canvas and how easy it is. Okay, so let's do the deployment. This is the org that I built the component, and this is the org that I'm going to deploy it. So a quick way would be to use the name that we had. Also, what else we had the custom wrapper, and I think some custom fields. So for the lead fields, we had these custom fields, some layouts, so we have picked our dependencies, and to be able to also complete this and use the web form in your Lightning Out form in your production, you would also need to create a new community and use the community's link you would need to create a new community. This is a much faster way for our use case, but you can also deploy communities with Blue Canvas, which is pretty easy also, but I'm hoping this is going to be another video. So after you see that our validation is successful, we can just deploy right now. And what you would need to do afterwards, after you deploy these components, is to create a new community, follow the exact steps that I showed you, and just change the URL here. In fact, you can actually use the same GitHub repo that you're hosting and just change the endpoints here, because the rest of everything is the same. So let's do a quick deploy. Let's see the deployment in action. As you see here, the deployment is complete. And you can write a nice comment. So this was one of the use cases for Lightning Out. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it's helpful for you. We're hoping to do more of these content in the future, so be sure to subscribe to our channel and give us tips. And if you're stuck with anything, just leave us a message and I'll try to help you. I'm Atlas John. And in the meantime, while we're coming up with new episodes or new ideas, you can reach me out on Twitter and LinkedIn. And you can also check out our blog posts on bluecanvas.io/blog. And thanks for watching. Goodbye.